China's President Xi Jinping has admitted that with the new phase of COVID, China is facing tough challenges. This was part of Xi's annual New Year's address, where he said that China has entered a new phase of COVID response where tough challenges remain. However, remember, despite massive global concerns over China's COVID crisis, Chinese government is not publishing daily COVID data for over a week. In fact, Australia has become the latest country now to mandate COVID tests for Chinese travelers. To discuss more on this, I'm joined by Mr. Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow of Taihe Institute and Chairman of Asia Narratives. Mr. Tangen, thank you so much for joining us. In fact, you had to wait for a little bit before we got you here. But thank you so much for joining us, and a Happy New Year to you. But firstly, what I would want to ask, sir, what would it take for the Chinese government to actually share data, whether it's with WHO, whether it's with other countries who are concerned about the massive COVID spike, because they have to realize at some point that it's not just about them, that this is a pandemic, the kind of proportions we have seen since 2020. It's important to share data with other countries, with the world, in order to curb this pandemic.
Yes, well, quite frankly, they had a press conference a little over a day ago where they talked about getting the information together. You have to remember that China, for 3 years did not have a COVID problem. They had less than 6,000 deaths, which is less than daily totals at the height of the pandemic for many countries. So at this juncture, it's spreading very, very quickly throughout. But, even your own specialists say nothing has changed. It was expected that it would go through China. It's not a question about a big danger from mutation. Obviously, the more people have it, there is a small chance. But the bigger issue is when people have it for a long period of time. And what you see developing in China is it's moving very quickly. But that brings about this challenge of how do you report accurately? I mean, the Indian press, the U.S. press, the international press has not been exactly very kind or even-handed towards China, or that's how they feel about data. They've been accused constantly of creating the data, creating the virus, lying about this, that, and the other thing. So they are going to make sure that they give an accurate count. That includes trying to analyze excess deaths over expected deaths, which is the true count. So at this juncture, China is cooperating. They will give the information to the WHO. It's just they want to make sure that it is in fact accurate.
Right. There is, of course, a lot of skepticism about this, whether or not China wants to make sure they're giving out the accurate picture or whether there's an attempt to hide data. That is how most of the world is, in fact, including the WHO, seems to be interpreting it that way. But we'll come to that, sir. But first, Mr. Tangen, if you can just tell us, how are we to interpret this? Are we to see this as actually a big admission by Xi Jinping? This is the first time that he's actually come out to say that China is facing tough challenges, referring to the COVID explosion that is taking place in the country right now. And this is part of his New Year's address. So is this a message that the Chinese president is giving out to the people to brace for tough times ahead? He had to roll back on his stringent COVID policy after responding to the massive protests that were seen across China regarding the previous policy that he was following. But how are we to interpret this message being sent out by Xi on the first day of the year?
Well, I've actually watched the entire speech a couple of times, and I've done a number of shows on it for a number of stations. If you actually watch it, you'll see that he's very calm. He reminds people of how far China has come in the last 40 years and to stay focused. In terms of COVID, he was talking about economic challenges more than health challenges. Obviously, there are issues. There's a lot of people, especially the elderly, who are dying. You can see that quite clearly from the obituaries that are being published. But when you're 90 plus years old, your life expectancy is, somewhere between 6 months and a year and a half. It's one of those things where almost anything, a cold, a fall, any event can cause you to, literally die of old age and complications. So at this juncture, they're trying to make sure that they get this accurately. And if you start looking, as soon as they release the data, I'm sure you'll see that a lot of it is in the older population. So at this juncture, China's not trying to hide anything. They were more than forthcoming in terms of the Wuhan virus. They were able to decode the genome and share it with everybody within a record period of time. It took a year with SARS. They did it in a series of weeks. China has been very forthcoming. It's one of the few nations that was continuing to track not only deaths, but also asymptomatic and symptomatic cases. India and the US, Europe, et cetera, most of the world gave up doing that last May. So this idea that China is trying to hide information, I think it's kind of the China bashing idea that seems to be so prevalent among many press groups.
Right. Lastly, before I let you go, Mr. Tangen, if you could tell us, as you're saying, that China is focusing on providing accurate data to the world, to the WHO as well as the other countries, but at a time when we are seeing that there is a spike in COVID once again, specifically once again originating from China. In fact, the president himself seems to be admitting that this is a big challenge ahead for him, ahead for the country. At this point in time, wouldn't it be best to be completely transparent? I mean, not just a week ago, they were actually publishing the data. If there was no concern back then why is there a concern now? What has changed in the last 1 week for them to actually stop publishing data with the world and stop publishing data and sharing it with the world?
Well, last week, the data that I saw was not accurate. I personally knew of more than 6 people, relatives and friends, who said that they had people who died and that it was apparently from COVID. They had not been able to keep up. I mean, you're talking about a nation of 1.4 billion. Even at its height, India had a tremendous trouble keeping up with the actual numbers. In India, it's a little bit different from China, but both suffer from the lack of acute care hospital beds. Mm-hmm. So at this juncture, while you're trying to treat these people, it is very hard to determine exactly how many people are, in fact, how many people are dying from those complications. Remember, in China, because of the healthcare system, when people suspect that they have COVID and they're showing early symptoms, they'll often show up at the hospital and they'll say, look, I want to be admitted because I'm afraid that, I'm going to die from this. So it's very, very hard. The hospitals can get easily overwhelmed. They're now responding by, saying to people, look, you have mild symptoms, you should stay at home and just recover there. And if you have these symptoms, you should come back. So at this juncture, China is doing the best it can after holding back the virus for 3 years. 3 years ago, it was extremely deadly. It would cause a tremendous amount of deaths, about 10 times the number it causes now. Today, it's much less deadly, and China has decided to open its borders, and because it knows that you, at some point, have to live with it. This is something that India had to do earlier on. The U.S. did. Not out of planning, but simply out of carelessness very early on in the virus. It cost over 1 million U.S. lives. Many of those could have been prevented, and that's not me saying that. That's the WHO and epidemiologists around the world.
Mm-hmm. Right, Mr. Einar Tangen there, thank you so much for joining us once again on this discussion that we're having in terms of China's response to the COVID spike in the country, and also how there is a growing clamor for China to share more data, which it has, in fact, not done till now. In fact, stopped publishing all data. But then, Mr. Einar Tangen, the other point of view there is that China wants to, in fact, be very sure of what data it is sharing with the world. But still, global concerns remain on the massive COVID spike in China.